Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our webinar participants from around the globe. Welcome to today's DevEx webinar sponsored by Girl Effect, where we're discussing best practice for safeguarding in a digital era. I'm Advas Saldinger, Associate Director here at DevEx, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to do a sound check to make sure everyone can hear me okay. If you can hear me, please type yes into the chat box. Okay, great. It looks like you guys can hear me. And we'll jump right in. Development organizations are increasingly designing programs that are engaging with children and young people online and through mobile devices. The digital world is rich with opportunity, yet rife with safeguarding pitfalls. How can we ensure safe spaces for digital engagement? Can we make the most of digital data while also protecting people's privacy? During this webinar, you'll discover how to move beyond a compliance lens to a more holistic approach. You'll also hear from our speakers about the successes and lessons learned as they've put digital safeguarding into practice. During the webinar, we'll be live tweeting from @DevEx. Our Twitter hashtag for this and other DevEx webinars is #DevExLive. If you want to interact with others listening to this webinar, then just use this hashtag. Again, that's #DevExLive. We'll look out for your tweets and retweet them, so please do join the conversation online. Today, I'm joined by Natalie Au, Global Gender and Safeguarding Director at Girl Effect, and Linda Raftery, Advisor on Girls' Digital Privacy, Safety and Security, and Digital Good Practice at Girl Effect. We're delighted to be able to draw on Natalie and Linda's expertise during today's webinar. I'm going to hand it over to Natalie and Linda to tell us more about their work and a new set of guidelines they've put together. Then we'll have plenty of time to answer your questions. You'll be able to enter questions using the chat box in the Ready Talk window. Feel free to submit questions at any time during this webinar. I'll be keeping track of your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as time allows. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, please send a message through the chat box, and one of my colleagues will assist you. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Natalie and Linda.
Great. Thank you very much, Adva. So we'd like to start today by introducing Girl Effect. We are a creative nonprofit with expertise in media, mobile technology, and international development. We build youth brands and mobile platforms to empower girls to change their lives. One of our core approaches is really rooted in focusing on girls first and girls as an individual. So really understanding her world, what her needs are, her interests, and her aspirations. As much as possible, we try to gather insights from girls themselves so that their views directly shape the work that we create. So we have something called a youth brand. These brands are deeply rooted in local culture, and through channels such as magazines, radio, TV, clubs, online, and music, they build movements where girls are able to find a new sense of identity, self-belief, confidence, as well as enabling communities to see them differently. We also have 3 unique mobile platforms that put girls in control like never before. So we have Girls Connect, which is an immersive world where girls can satisfy their curiosities about growing up on their own terms. To do this, we've repurposed basic IVR technology. So that's technology when you call your bank and you get a list of automated options to select from. Girls are given the option to select stories about girls like them, and after listening, they're connected to a real-life role model who's been trained to be a trusted voice and answer their questions. Second, we have Springster, which is a global mobile platform in partnership with Facebook's Free Basics that connects girls across the world. We're live in over 66 markets, and Springster features content designed for girls and created by girls themselves with educational content that inspires them on key issues that affect their lives. And lastly, we have something called Tega, which is technology-enabled girl ambassadors. It's a mobile-based peer-to-peer research app that provides safe, fast, and scalable, authentic research around the world. We recruit and train girls and young women. They become qualified researchers, and then we deploy them into their own communities to gain authentic, real-time insights that help shape programs and monitor activities. So safeguarding has always been factored into our work at Girl Effect right from the beginning, but it's definitely gone through evolutions over the years in terms of how we think about safeguarding and design with it in mind. We revised our safeguarding policy back in April 2017 and clearly identifying 3 core principles as the foundation of our safeguarding approach. So the first one is around promoting the welfare of children and young people and enabling them to achieve the best outcomes for them. The second is around preventing harm through proactive measures to identify and mitigate risks. And then the third is around protecting children and young people by responding quickly and effectively whenever harm or abuse is identified. So today is a really exciting moment for us at Girl Effect because we get to share some of our own successes, challenges, and learning with you all. And we really see safeguarding as an art and not a science, and so we're really keen to learn from others about their own journeys and how the global body of best practice and evidence is being jointly created in the sector. So modernizing safeguarding, why now? People today have greater access to digital all over the world. Two-thirds of the world's population have a mobile phone, and whilst that figure is disproportionately representing more men than women, we know that in the next 5 years, 2/3 of new mobile subscribers are going to be female. So this is a huge opportunity for us to create impact at scale by connecting people in new ways, ways they never thought were possible, and by unlocking access to information like never before. So whilst the possibilities seem endless, there's also considerable risks for people when they go online. So there are safeguarding concerns for anyone who accesses the digital world, but we focus specifically on children and young people, and then certain considerations being given to girls because of the additional vulnerabilities they face. So we know that traditional approaches to safeguarding wouldn't cut it anymore, and even our old safeguarding policy wasn't up with the times in terms of how we were designing with mobile technology in mind. This was particularly relevant around data and how we keep data safe. Whilst it's fundamental for us to design better programs, it's also bringing in a lot of risk about how we're collecting stories and storing sensitive data from vulnerable populations.
So hi, this is Linda, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the guidance that we've put in place at Girl Effect. So I've been working with Girl Effect for about 4 years, specifically on digital safeguarding as the organization started incorporating a lot more digital into its work. And when we started looking around in 2014 for guidance on digital safeguarding, we found that a lot of it was kind of in info security speak or academic, and we had a really hard time finding existing guidance that was in language that would speak to NGOs and to the development community. A lot of it was focused on the EU, the US, Australia. A lot of it was looking at how to put in place technical fixes and sort of prevent children from seeing certain things and putting in restrictions on their browsing, that sort of thing. We didn't find a lot of guidance that would work in the types of contexts where we were working, where a lot of people are, on very limited bandwidth or only accessing data on a pay-as-you-go rate. And so we really thought we needed to put something together that would take into consideration kind of the characteristics of the girls and young people that we were working with. A lot of them share or borrow phones. A lot of them do not have free access and free use. They're monitored. A lot of girls are monitored by parents in terms of what they access. So we really wanted to take a look at that and ended up having to create something on our own that would help us to balance, as Nat said, all of that, potential for participation and information access with responsibility that we had as an organization to privacy and protection. So the guidance that we came up with ended up coming out in 2016. Some of you might have seen it around, we really wanted to look at safeguarding as a value, not as something that was a tick box or a compliance issue. We wanted to think of it very holistically in terms of, online, offline, the way that girls are moving back and forth in these different spaces. Really thinking about context in each case of safeguarding. So safeguarding is not something that you can just kind of put a checkbox in place that the same thing is going to be relevant for every situation. We wanted to make sure we were helping people think about context. We had to try to balance people's interest in a simple, usable safeguarding framework with the need for detail. So for example, if we said, it's important that you use encryption, then of course we're going to get the question back that someone says, well, what encryption tool should I use? What is encryption? How do I do encryption? So there was a lot of work that we had to do to kind of try to balance a document that could support people in thinking about safeguarding in their own context without being prescriptive and without not giving them enough information. The other things that we learned in that process was that we really needed to build safeguarding into the design process from the very start and not look at it at the end. We needed to have safeguarding point people on various teams across the organization so that they could identify and sort of flag different safeguarding risks and as different conversations are happening across the organization. We really realized that we need capacity, time, and resources in order to do a good job with digital safeguarding. And then we wanted to bring it up to a higher level of the organization so that it wasn't just a nice to have thing, but that was something that was incorporated in our policies, that the board was aware that we were doing it. And then lastly, I'll just say that the GDPR has been an amazing incentive to get people interested and to get people actually kind of worried about digital safeguarding. It's been a nice kind of stick, and so we wanted to also have this sort of carrot approach of having lots of resources for people when GDPR did come into place so that we were kind of already on the road towards understanding and building GDPR compliance into our work. I'm going to hand back over to Nat now.
Great. So as Linda was talking about, we had already gone on quite a journey very early on into 2016, but when we revisited our safeguarding policy, we realized that there was a lack of alignment between how some of our digital products and our guidelines were developing and how that sat within our global safeguarding policy. So as you'll see, there's a couple of bubbles up on the screen that talk about where we were a couple of years ago as an organization. So it used to be just a girls safeguarding policy. Even though we did work with boys and young people, we were only focusing on girls within the policy. It sat under operations, and I know that safeguarding as a function can often sit under technical or operational functions. But we felt that by it sitting under operations, at least for Girl Effect, it limited how we considered safeguarding is a core part of our programming in the beginning. In terms of policy coherence, we had a separate digital policy. We had a guidance that wasn't actually connected to our safeguarding policy. We had something called a Girl Safety Toolkit that had tips and guidance around doing things like risk assessments, but they didn't actually sit all together and speak to one another. We focused on the physical world around us, despite us being quite progressive in developing and prototyping our digital offer. This didn't work. The policy wasn't really relevant for things like Springster or when we were prototyping Tega. And then lastly, we had girl safety officers, but this was in effect another job description that had been tacked on to somebody within the gender team that they needed to take on in their role. So it was a really big ask. So what does our safeguarding approach look like today? So we recognize that all children, so boys and girls, and young people up to 25 are captured within our policy. So we've built in nuance around things like consent and parental engagement when it comes to children versus young people, which is really important for us. We have the safeguarding team globally sitting under a technical function, which we found has enabled us to really embed safeguarding in a much more holistic approach than it rather being a potential tick box exercise that can sometimes be the case. We have one global policy that is compliant with the Keeping Children Safe International Standards for Safeguarding, which is contextualized in each of the countries where we have a physical presence. We have supporting guidance sitting under the policy as well that are tools that help us bring different standards to life in the policy. We have 10 standards that cover everything from governance to children's participation to safe partnerships, and now very critically also includes digital privacy and security. And then lastly, we've really upped our game in terms of resourcing. So we have a dedicated team in London with resources in all countries where we have a physical presence, and where we don't have a physical presence or where we operate through partners, we have focal points who are accountable for safeguarding activities in those countries.
Hi, so it's Linda back again. So just this morning, we just published an updated set of safeguarding tips and guidance. We've been working on these for the past 3 or 4 months and trying to make sure that our original, that we're taking into consideration the learning from the first version, and that we were adapting it and making sure that it was building into all of the new requirements with GDPR. We had a lot of those in the earlier guidance, but we wanted to go through and double check and make sure that we were consistent with what the GDPR is recommending. For those of you who aren't familiar with GDPR, it's the General Data Protection Regulation that was just put into effect on May 25th across the EU, and that's also starting to impact on the way some other countries are starting to develop or enhancing their own digital privacy and safety and security measures and legal frameworks. So as Nat mentioned, this is really where we're putting together our digital guidelines and sort of trying to go a little bit deeper, and it's an accompaniment to the overall safeguarding policy for Girl Effect. We really wanted to be able to support staff. We wanted to build in consistency because teams were trying different things. We wanted to pull their experiences together and kind of share across different teams what different templates and tools that the teams were using. And we also felt like, since we've been thinking about this for 4 or 5 years, that we really wanted to bring something out that could potentially support the wider field so that people aren't spending a lot of resources rebuilding tools and guidance. So we have our guidance, but we've built it on a lot of the earlier guidance and tools and tips that have come out. And I guess the last thing to say is that this is a stretch document. So everything in this document is something that perhaps some teams are doing, other teams maybe not quite there yet, but it's a document that we're aiming to meet. And we'll probably need to update it again in a couple of years as new tools and technologies and new risks come into play with digital. Go over to the next slide. So in this document, these are the areas that we're covering. I think I went. Okay. Yeah, so these are the sort of 8 areas, and we wanted to build the document in a way that people could pull out the sections that were relevant to them, because we know that, again, from what we learned with the earlier document and the earlier tips, that it can be pretty overwhelming for people if they're kind of new to the area of digital privacy and security. So we made our best effort to try to create a document that was designed in a way that people could pull out sections and could easily consume and go back to it when they needed to. So I'm going to run through some of the main parts of the document together with Nat, and so she'll take this first one around the big picture.
Great, thank you. So I think before we embark on designing any intervention, we want to conduct work to assess a number of things, but really importantly, a key set of questions we look into is whether or not the project is going to add value to the people we aim to create this for. So one way of ensuring we do this is to always co-create our work with girls and young people and never just for them. So one example of this is Girls Connect, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. So we had initially entered into conversations with our current partner, ISON Group, which is one of Africa's largest IT companies. So they came to us and said, we have this IVR technology, we have a great platform and infrastructure, and they wanted to repurpose it for social good. So we knew that we had the potential to build something where girls could access on-demand audio content and weaving in a component of girls speaking to a role model. But before we agreed to anything, we conducted a series of co-design workshops with girls and their parents to really understand more about the potential value of a product like this. And so when we were able to validate the demand for such type of product, this was particularly helpful in an environment where the ability to scale physical safe spaces where thousands of girls could access information and support was a huge challenge. And this project is set in northern Nigeria at the minute. So a couple of other questions that we consider at this initial stage are around anticipating unintended consequences and building in those mitigation strategies, even in the initial prototype phase. And we do this by taking a very iterative design approach. And so for TEGA, which is the research methodology, it started getting prototyped back in 2015. And if you can imagine, that was in a few communities in the north of Nigeria. And back in 2015, mobile ownership, particularly amongst adolescent girls, was even less than it was today. And so there was a lot of potential stigma and risk that we needed to address early on in the design stage. Another important area that we look at is around partners and working to build something where we can be stronger together. So we know it gets really complicated if organizations aren't able to partner on the ground where work is being delivered and where long-lasting challenges for the target audiences come into play when we take these siloed interventions.
So one of the things that Girl Effect does quite a lot of is research. We do design research, as Nat mentioned. We do workshops and focus groups with girls, and we speak with parents and gatekeepers and local community groups and members and all of that. So we really, when we start off these guidelines, these tips and guidelines, we wanted to talk a little bit about safe research and evidence building. Some of the things that we do, that we go through in the document and that we do as an organization are making sure we do background checks on any research partners. We normally work with research partners that are based in the countries where we're working. And so we make sure that they've got safeguarding training on our safeguarding policy, or that they have their own safeguarding policy that meets the same level of standards that we have. We do risk assessments before we do any type of research, both traditional types of research if we're going face-to-face with girls, or if we're thinking, and when thinking about what data we're going to be collecting during the research. And also we make sure that we have incident reporting procedures in place and signposting. What that means is that if we happen to be in a workshop, and this has happened in the past, if we're in a workshop, we're talking about something, and there's someone in the workshop who's had a difficult experience with relation to that topic, they might disclose something that's happened to them, or they might feel upset or something like that in a workshop if we're talking about specific issues. So we want to always make sure that we have someone in the workshop that they can go to talk with if there's something they need to talk about, and that we know in each place that we're doing research where we can refer girls if they need a further follow-up on a particular case. And then we also think about consent and making sure that we're transparent with the guardians and with the girls themselves, or boys if we're working with boys, to make sure that they understand what this research is, why we're doing it, what happens to the information that we're collecting, who we're sharing it with. And we've updated our consent policy and consent framework so that it's aligned with GDPR. We also, during the research, we really try to find out from girls directly what their own strategies are for avoiding risk online. And that helps us when we think about design, when we think about what types of moderation we might need to have in place, if it's a website or a situation where we have girls who are interacting and commenting with each other or with others. Some of the things that we've learned is that we know girls often feel unsafe on social media, and they have different tactics. They might use fake names or create fake accounts so that their identities aren't revealed. Or sometimes, in some cases, girls have just said, well, I don't really post. I just like things. I don't post because I'm afraid people are going to say this, that, or the other about me. We've learned that girls don't like having their phone numbers visible on WhatsApp, because in some places, men will just dial numbers that they find trying to get a hold of a girl on the other end, or a female on the other end. And so in some situations, girls feel quite uncomfortable having their phone numbers visible on WhatsApp. So that's something we need to think about when we're designing, or if we're thinking about working with WhatsApp. And so those are the types of design challenges that we learn about when we're doing research, and that we try to incorporate when we're designing our own products or thinking about any third-party platforms that we're working with. We also, in thinking through self-reporting or gathering feedback, sometimes we do polls and surveys on our Springster site. And so we need to be quite careful in terms of thinking about whether girls might be borrowing or sharing phones, and if they're participation in providing feedback or answering polls and surveys could potentially put them at risk if someone else is also accessing the same phone that they are. We also think about reputation risk. If in some contexts it might be seen as a girl that has a phone, people might ask, where did she get that phone? Why does she have a phone? Is she trading that phone for sexual favors, or all those things we really try to understand within the context. And then we also think about whether the products and services and tools that we're creating create expense or cost for our users that might be above and beyond what we feel comfortable with. So we try to make sure that we're thinking about all those different barriers. In the TAGA program that Nat mentioned, we equip older girls to conduct research with younger girls. In that case, we have a policy where we provide them with phones because we didn't think that the bring your own device sort of approach would be appropriate because of all the types of data that they're gathering and collecting, and also because they probably don't have smartphones that take video. So when we've created an app, it's the TAGA app, and that's the app that the older girls use to conduct research. And that app has a number of safety features. So the data is all encrypted from start to finish. We have a remote wipe, or we can, if a phone is lost, we can remotely remove all the data from that phone. The data disappears from the phone once it's been uploaded to our content hub, which is also secured on the back end. And it has an emergency help button that alerts specific people that a girl has identified if a girl is in a situation where she feels endangered. So those are some of the kind of technical fixes, and also the wider approaches that we've taken to thinking about safeguarding during research and evidence processes. I'm going to hand back over to Nat to talk a little bit about privacy by design.
Great, thanks. So when we design products and services right from the start, we always think about privacy and security. So for example, with Girls Connect, because it's accessed via IVR, we had the additional complication of not being able to see users face-to-face and really explain the terms and conditions of the service in a way that we were confident that they were going to understand it. I think also because we were targeting this product at girls 14 to 16, there was also an issue of parental consent, so needing them to also understand what the service is for and the value of it. So we really needed to make sure that the terms and conditions we built into the IVR were something that people understood when they went to access it. So we recorded a very simple terms and conditions because we do have to record all of the calls. And when we tested the terms and conditions, we actually got feedback from girls that they felt they were empowered, and they felt like Girls Connect were treating them as individuals and really respecting their privacy and security because of the way it was asking them to opt in rather than automatically assuming that they were signed up to something. So we designed it in a way where girls actually felt like they were in control and they really understood the messaging that we were trying to convey. We also designed the model so that if parents call in, which they do, when they get through to a role model, the role models themselves are trained to be very well versed in explaining the service and why it is targeting girls, so that any relevant stakeholder, whether it be parents or religious leaders calling in, can be well informed about what the activity is and the benefit it brings to girls.
And also, I was just going to give a few examples of how we've incorporated privacy by design into Springster. So Springster, as Nat mentioned earlier, it's like an online magazine that creates content and conversation aimed at girls. So in that platform, it is a social media type of a platform, and what we've done there in order to limit the personal data that we capture on our users is we don't ask them for their phone numbers, we don't ask them for emails, we don't ask them for their names. The only thing that we collect when they register is a username, which we ask them that it should not be the same as their real name. We capture gender and we capture age because we really wanted to limit the amount of personally identifiable information that we were capturing on the site. We sometimes run polls and surveys on Springster, and so we're in the process of updating our terms and conditions and our privacy policy. We're trying to do that in ways that are very simple and clear so that girls can understand what exactly is data and what are we doing with the information that we collect from them so that they can be very clear about what's happening when they answer a poll or a survey. We've also had quite a few discussions on what our lawful basis for data collection is. This is something that comes up in the GDPR. There are a few different reasons that you could be legitimately and legally collecting data. And so for each one of our processes at Girl Effect, we've gone through a data mapping exercise that I'm going to talk about a little bit later that helps us understand whether what is the proper legitimate reason for us to be collecting data, and then how we can make sure that everything is aligned. So if we're using consent, and this is something that comes up in the GDPR, if we're using consent as a reason, as a way for people to provide us permission to use their data, that really puts the responsibility on a parent or guardian or on the girl herself to understand what's going on and to decide whether she's going to consent to it or not. And then if we're using legitimate interest, which is a different sort of legal regime for data collection, that really moves the onus back onto us as Girl Effect to thinking through all of the different ways that we need to be transparent and inform people about what we're doing with their data, why we're collecting it, who we're sharing it with. And so when we're looking at the TEGA project, for example, we've really built in privacy from the beginning. And what we've done there is we have an audio consent recording that parents and guardians can listen to. Rather than giving them a handout or a really long form, we've tried to simplify it and create an audio consent that they listen to. And at the end, there's a little quiz that they take, a 3-question quiz that helps us understand whether they've really gotten a sense of what this type of research is, or why their daughters might be involved in it. So in that sense, it's been interesting because we've actually found that more people are opting not to participate after hearing the audio consent, and we think that's because they've understood what's actually going on, and that they've understood a lot more about the research process, and they're making a much more informed decision about whether they'd like to participate or not. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is related to risk assessments. So one of the things that is mandated with the GDPR, if you're working with sensitive data or with children, or with any type of data that could potentially create harm, you have to do a data privacy impact assessment. So at Girl Effect, we've always done risk assessments, but one of the things that we've incorporated now is a data privacy aspect to our overall risk assessment. And these, again, go beyond just thinking about data or just thinking about traditional processes. They're combined so that the risk assessment is more holistic. Mentioned earlier that we've been doing data mapping. So this is where we get individual teams together and we sit down in a room and we do a workshop where we use lots of Post-it notes and lots of participation, and we really talk through each one of our processes and what is the exact data that we're collecting on people for each process. Then we can go through, once we have a really good handle of all the data that we're collecting, we can get a sense of whether we actually need to collect all that data and start removing data streams that might be putting girls at risk. So we look at those data streams. We try to reduce the amount of data that we're collecting on people so that we don't put them at as much risk. And we also look at data flows. So if we're talking about using, as Nat said, the interactive voice response line, the IVR line with Girls Connect, we think about, okay, you have a girl who has a phone. She's doing this thing into the phone, then where does the data go, and then where does it go from there? And really thinking of this, kind of mapping out of all the different servers and people that might potentially see data, and just getting a good sense of how to restrict all that and keep it as safe and secure as possible. So that really helped us determine for each one of our different efforts at Girl Effect how we could best manage the data that we were collecting and how we could secure it and ensure that we were being transparent and keeping privacy top of mind. The next slide is about data protection and security. We're not going to go very deep into this. It's a field that a lot of folks who are in the IT world have been working on for a long time, really thinking about data flows through the infrastructure of an organization. But I just want to mention here that that there are some general steps and general data flows. So what I mean is that, if you look at this at this slide, we usually collect data, we usually analyze or use the data for something. We usually transmit it, whether it's from my laptop to someone else's laptop or it's from a phone to a server. There's some type of data transmission that happens. There's often data sharing, whether it's a monitoring and evaluation partner that's sharing data with an organization that has contracted it, or whether it's data sharing amongst partner organizations. And then there's a process whereby we think about, are we going to maintain this data? For how long? Should we remove it from our systems? Should we aggregate it so that it doesn't identify people, et cetera? So when we're thinking about all of these different things, normally what we do is at the very beginning we think about a design, a data design, so that we think about all of these different elements at the very beginning, as we mentioned, this kind of privacy by design when you're designing an M&E effort, when you're designing a tool, when you're designing a project, really thinking through all these elements, all these different stages in the data life cycle, and making sure that, that we've taken them all into consideration. We've got them in our design and our planning, and then we can do a much better job of informing people what's going to happen with their data once we collect it. Go to the next slide, which is a quick one on legalities. Here we just want to highlight that each country has its own types of legal frameworks and regulations. Sometimes these relate to child protection. Sometimes there's a mandatory reporting, for example, if you come across a child that reports some type of abuse. Other countries do not have mandatory reporting. There are new data laws coming into place in different countries. South Africa has a law, for example. Rwanda has a data revolution law. So it's really important when we're working in various countries that we make sure that we understand what the laws are in the various countries and make sure that we're aware of them and we're designing our programs to meet those. Or if we're deciding that we're not going to meet local legislation, we should have a reason and we should understand why we've decided not to meet local legislation, if that happens to be the case in some countries. One thing that we're always recommend when it comes to data protection and data security and all things related to GDPR is that people try to take advice from legal counsel. That's also a challenge because not everyone has access to legal counsel, and especially smaller organizations might not have the budget to get legal support. So that's another reason we wanted to put these guidelines out, because we thought maybe we could at least provide some sort of orientation. We emphasize it's not legal advice, but maybe it could help people just as they get started. Going to the next slide. Our slide about content, and Matt's going to run us through that one.
Thank you. So when it comes to content, as you can see up on the slide, there's a lot of different considerations we need to think about when it comes to safeguarding measures. The digital safeguarding tips and guidance document that Linda mentioned today has a lot more detail on these points. But one example to go a bit deeper into is around Springster and our safe moderation approach. So there are a couple of core things to remember when it comes to moderating a digital platform, particularly where we're really actively encouraging comments and conversation amongst our users. The first is around moderation on a third-party social media platform. That could bring additional safeguarding considerations that are simply outside of our control. So for example, if somebody is a Springster user, if they're using the platform on our own platform, we can make sure that their profile details are anonymized. But if they shift off of Springster and go on to another social media platform to consume different content, the visibility of their profile information is also likely to change. The second is around having a code of conduct for the moderators themselves. This is really critical because it sets standards and expectations for the approach that we expect them to take while moderating, and is really important, particularly when potential issues of disclosure come up and they need clear guidance on what to do. The third is around regularly talking to the community around what the rules are. This is really important for users because it helps keep it fresh in their minds around the sort of behavior that we want the community of Springster users to be fostering. So we also have a reporting protocol for Springster if any of these guidelines are broken. So there's more detail in this document that we're launching today. But just to very briefly mention, So we need to determine if the content is inappropriate or if there's an actual risk to, or harm that is indicated within the content, for example, if a disclosure is made. So depending on the nature of the potential risk, there are different strategies that are deployed. So for example, we might just remove the content, we might post a tailored response back to the comment that was made, or we might flag it straight to the safeguarding focal point to discuss together how to respond. We also have all situations that are recorded in the moderation log, and Girl Effect staff also do spot checking as well, so we go through and make sure that the moderation is actually being adhered to according to our guidelines.
And then the last section of the guidelines is around partners, third parties, and social media, because we do all of our work in partnership all the time. And so we wanted to make sure that all of the partners we're working with are also taking safeguarding and digital privacy and security into account. So we have safeguarding agreements and data sharing agreements with all of our partners, regardless of the type of partner. So just because it's an in-kind partner doesn't mean that, that we wouldn't put a data agreement in place with them. And we've got some sample language that people could potentially build from in the document. We've certainly built on other people's safeguarding agreement documents in order to put these together. So feel free to look through the document, and if there are templates that are useful for you to adapt, then you're very welcome to do that. We also want to make sure when we're selecting partners or data processing partners, that means anyone that's going to be doing anything with data that we've commissioned to be collected as Girl Effect, we want to make sure that they are also following all the different privacy and security aspects, especially those that are related to the GDPR. So we make sure that those partners have in place certain elements of digital safety, digital security before we agree to share any data with them. We've also been improving our due diligence process so that we're able to do better background checks on the organizations and partners, social media parties that we might work with. We do safeguarding briefing and training depending on what the different role of the partner is. And one of the big kind of challenges that we do see in this area is figuring out how to partner or how to use social media sites that we're not necessarily in control of. So it's kind of the big platforms that are out there. How do we work with different social media? How do we work with big technology partners that we don't have as much control over the relationship with? And so that's something we're thinking about quite a lot as we move forward. And so I think that's it to kind of wrap up the contents of the digital safety guidelines. We're just going to mention a couple of things that we're looking into as we go forward, and then I think we'll open it up for comments and questions.
Yeah, so we just wanted to leave you all before we open up with a couple of exciting areas that Girl Effect is going to be focusing on in the year ahead. So as you've probably just listened to, there's a lot going on, and the nuance is really tricky and complicated. And has a lot of implications. So for us, it's going to be continuing to get up to speed with what we need to be doing, training staff and partners as well on digital safeguarding, our understanding of it, and the lessons that we're learning on a day-by-day basis with all of our brands and products, and making sure that all of that learning is disseminated. And I think the second thing is around GDPR. So it's just come into effect. We've done a lot of work already to assess and ensure that our work is GDPR compliant, but there's still a really long way to go to embed that learning and understanding across the organization.
I think lastly, we're also, as newer technologies come out and newer applications and tools come out, we're continually also updating the kinds of tools and products that we're working with. So for example, right now we're working on developing a chatbot, which is a little bit new territory for us. And so as we develop the chatbot, we're again going through all of these sort of tips and guidelines and thinking about how do we make sure that it's private, that we're thinking about privacy and security from the beginning. How do we manage any potential type of disclosure if it happens on a chatbot, that sort of thing. So we're constantly trying to evolve our work to meet the new technology tools that are out there, but really thinking through how does that shift and change what we need to do in terms of keeping girls and boys and young people safe. So that is it for us. I think we'll hand back over to Adva now.
Yes. Thank you both so much. I've seen some questions coming in. So we'll get to those questions now. One question about the GDPR did come in, and it was really trying to look at, how is it impacting organizations who are working in Africa? Obviously, it's European-focused regulations, but how should development organizations be thinking about how it applies to their work in Africa, and how are you sort of evaluating? Obviously, Girl Effect is based in Europe, but how are you evaluating what its role should be in your work globally, and how should other organizations be thinking about that?
Sure, I can take that one. This is Linda. One of the things that I think is really important is that we see GDPR as an enhancement of rights. And so as organizations, I think in the development space that care about people's rights and well-being, we care about people's privacy, we care about ethics. So we really think that GDPR is something that all organizations, to the degree possible, should be trying to comply with, and trying to, as we said, it's kind of a stretch, but really trying to incorporate some of the good rights that are related to data. And we feel that it shouldn't only be limited to EU citizens, but that everyone that we work with should have those same rights with respect to data. Also, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of countries that are starting to think about their own GDPR type of legal restriction or regulations that are coming in. So we know that South Africa has their own law. It's called POPI, I believe. Rwanda has a law. We've heard that some countries are actually just kind of cutting and pasting GDPR and trying to incorporate that into their national laws. So we think that it's something that organizations around the world should be thinking about and trying to get up to speed with.
Great. We also had a question about how does safeguarding curate the experience of users on the content they access, and whether it is at all prohibitive of the information that they can access, or whether it aims to sort of influence what they can access.
Sorry, could you just clarify a little bit more?
Yeah, I think the question is whether safeguarding has an impact on what information they can access, whether it would at all be sort of prohibitive or influence what sort of content they might be able to access.
Yeah, I think for our platforms and most of our products, I think you need to proactively sign up to the terms and conditions and give your consent. So by doing that, you get access to our platform. So within that, it doesn't necessarily mean that certain safeguarding measures are put on different pieces of content that would get pushed out across our platforms. But I think we'd probably go back right from the beginning in terms of actually getting onto the platform and making sure that consent is meaningfully gained. And if that isn't possible for whatever reason, that could be a potential barrier. I do know, I could also see another question around kind of community permission or parental permission, and I guess that in a way is around safeguarding and access to content. We need to make sure that the way that we're designing and giving access to our content is done in a way that people understand what the platform is for and how to use it as well, and that could bring in parental consent as well.
I can just add on to that. When we're doing content development, we base a lot of that on research that we're doing in country, and as I mentioned, thinking through together with local partners what are some of the content areas or the topics that might be sensitive in different countries. Is there heavy government censorship, for example? Is it are there blasphemy laws that we need to think about? So we try to think very carefully about content and thinking about whether content that if the girl is reading particular content on a phone, can that put her at risk because of the nature of the content. So that's why we do a lot of research before we publish and post anything, so that we're sure that we can be a little bit progressive maybe around certain gender issues, or providing information that girls may not have access to through other means, but also making sure that that access is considering risk as well, so that we're not getting girls in deep trouble because they're looking at our websites or something like that. I guess actually the last thing too, we try to post content on safeguarding and do some short pieces about privacy and how girls can think about their privacy. And that's something that we do on Springster is share content around privacy and safety.
Great. There was one question sort of along those lines asking, who is ultimately responsible for the creation of awareness of sort of the negative or positive impacts of digital life, because especially the girls and young people you're working with are, as you said, accessing not only your platforms but other social media. So who is responsible, and how do you sort of put, for that education of what possible downsides and also the benefits are of engaging with those platforms?
So maybe I'll just briefly say we do have some content on Springster that talks about how to keep yourself safe online, whether it's a Girl Effect platform or any other kind of platform that girls in this case might be accessing. So we do address it. We do recognize as well, though, that we can't actually control what people do and don't access outside of Girl Effect's content. But we do always have content or messaging around how to keep yourself safe, and a general awareness around some of the dangers of going on other platforms and potential misinformation that you might read. So developing critical skills and understanding that and understanding the risk.
We also have a question about how you address the possible gaps between girls and their parents in their understanding of social media, technology, and the potential for possible different generational ethical perceptions as you try to gain consent and put in place these safeguarding measures.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, oops, sorry. That's what I was mentioning earlier.
I think there's a delay. Go ahead.
As part of the research that we do, we do research both with girls and boys and young people, and with who we call community influencers, and then also with guardians and caretakers and parents. And there is in some places the gap is much wider than in other places, so it tends to be quite context specific. So we try to get an understanding of how involved parents are in managing their children's use of mobile devices and different tools, and we have created almost a box of four that we look at, and we look at whether access is controlled or whether it's free, and we look at whether it's limited or unlimited. And so you might have girls in one country that have free and unlimited access, meaning they have their own phone, they go online as often as they want, no one is checking up on what they're doing. And you might have girls in another country where they're borrowing a phone from a parent, and the parent is then scrolling through every single thing that they do on the phone. And so we'll find those different scenarios. They're not always country specific, and within countries, different parents manage their children's use of social media and of mobile phones and the internet in very different ways, but there are some general trends. So we found, for example, in our research in Indonesia and the Philippines, that girls that we worked with were much freer many of them had their own phones, and many of them were free to search and scroll and pretty much do whatever we want. And that situation was quite different, for example, in northern Nigeria, where girls' access was much more controlled and much more limited than the girls in Indonesia and the Philippines. And so we try to, as we design, again, content, and as we design our sites and our services, we try to take that into consideration. And then as Nat mentioned, We also try to have ways that if a parent should call into the Girls Connect IVR line, we make sure that those who answer the phone are ready to answer any parent questions so that that we can allay any parent concerns, or if we need to adapt a platform because it's very upsetting to parents, we would want to consider whether we should adapt it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to briefly offer our experience of developing Girls Connect, because it was it is a mobile-based service. And so as much as we were co-designing with girls, we also co-designed with parents at every step of the way to really understand what their concerns were and their frustrations around girls maybe having access to this, whether it be the stigma around the actual phone use itself or very practical things around the cost of use. And when we were in our last phase of prototyping, I was actually in northern Nigeria, and we were talking to some parents, and this father said, I love Girls Connect so much, I just have to hand my phone over to the 30 girls who come in my home and get together because it's their time together. And you could see the real admiration that he had for the service, because he could see the benefits that it was offering for his girls and her friends in a way that he couldn't. And so I think it's really important to take stakeholders, and particularly gatekeepers, along the journey, because even though you're designing something that might be trying to benefit girls and impact girls' lives, girls don't live in a bubble, and their decision-making power is very limited in many regards, particularly when it comes to digital access. So just as much as girls are one of our key stakeholders, so are parents.
Great. I wanted to share a comment from Abra Anthony. She says, I would love to connect to learn more about what you've encountered as you think through responsible development of a chatbot for your work, because at USAID they are doing some research on appropriate use of AI in development, and they'd love to learn from your perspective. So hopefully you'll be able to connect afterwards. And as we close, I just wanted to try to get your take, maybe 3 key takeaways that other organizations can be thinking about as they look to create these policies and put in place digital safeguards, how they can apply some of the lessons that you've learned and some of the work that you've done into their own work.
3 key takeaways. I would say one takeaway is that there is now quite a lot of guidance that's out there. Personally, I've worked on guidance for 3 different organizations. I'm happy to share that out in the comments, maybe some of the guidance that's out there. So I would say, really try to build on what's already out there rather than everyone starting from scratch and building up digital guidelines. That would be one. I don't know if you have one ready, Nat.
Yeah, 2 popped up in my mind, so together we can meet your 3 requests. So I would say one thing is don't rush it, because just because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean you can't do it, but it also means that you need to be very careful with how you do it. And so I think we're very curious as an organization about how we can push development boundaries, but do it in a responsible way, and sometimes that just takes time. So don't rush it and really think through what the implications are. I think also looking across different sectors, even though they're not as developed in some ways as the development sector, there are still certain processes that they have in place that are very interesting to learn from. So you can take that learning and think about how to adapt it into your own work. So we have a couple of partnerships with private sector, and we've been introduced to some of their safety and privacy approaches, which isn't necessarily a perfect fit for the work at Girl Effect, but we've been able to take some of those principles and ways of thinking and adapt it to be fit for purpose for what we need.
Great. Well, I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our scheduled time for this webinar. But thank you all so much for joining us today, and we really hope that you've enjoyed the conversation. If you want to watch this webinar again, we'll be emailing it to you shortly and posting it on devx.com, so look out for that in the near future. Again, a big thank you to Linda and Natalie for taking the time to speak with us today. If you'd like to learn more about the guidelines, please feel free to send an email to info@girleffect.org. And on behalf of DevX, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I hope you'll join us for our next online event. Thanks so much.